Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everyone here again. I feel like we're old friends now, even though I haven't met a lot of people in person. So thank you for coming. As you know, this is the last grant workshop, and I feel kind of sad because throughout the days that we've had these in the evening, I kind of look forward to it, to seeing everybody and learning things new, because there's always something new to learn about the Rotary Foundation. There's just so many parts about it. Ingrid is with us again this evening. And also just a reminder, the sessions will be recorded and we'll get slides and everything out to you as we get things together. Yesterday and a couple of the other days, there have been a lot of questions on stewardship, qualification, and one of the question that came up several times is whether a district can kind of demand that in order for a club to get grant funds that they give to the annual fund. That's a question that comes under stewardship. I will say, just from my own experience, when my district was audited by an auditor, we did require that clubs give to the foundation, and they said that was a no-no, that you cannot have that as a requirement. So, but they would, if we, we can find out. The reason I'm bringing this up is if there's enough interest, I think we can have a workshop about this coming up before the end of the year. So what I did was put my email in the chat. So if you're interested, and if there are enough people interested, we can get Christian Papera and Christine, who works on the share end of things, for a workshop. So, I just wanted to put that out before I forgot about it. As Steve said, we're going to be talking about global grant scholarships and VTTs. So here's Steve for our last night together.
Thank you so much, Eileen, for opening up our final workshop. For those of you who have been tuning in all 5 nights, thank you very much for putting this time aside. And I'm hoping that people who are involved in scholarships and vocational training teams are either working on humanitarian type global grants or working with somebody who does that, because I'm not going to be able to cover in as much depth the basic application, but as our first session, if you go back and look at that, you can see some of the details. Tonight, we're going to zero in on what's special about global grant scholarships, and then we're going to move on to what's special about vocational training teams and hopefully give you some important information if you are involved in making those happen in your district or in your club. All right, so this is a presentation just especially for all of you in zones 28 and 32. This evening, we are going to cover in the first 30 minutes of this session, review of global grant scholarships, the timeline of how that happens, a review of requirements and agreements. We're going to talk a little bit about US bound scholars. There's some special rules to just be aware of, and then review the scholarship supplement really quickly. We're going to have to move quickly, so luckily this is being recorded and you can go back and and review. So at the beginning of each of these sessions, I do want to point out who is who for zones 28 and 32. I'm Steve Sundstrom, a regional grants officer. I cover most of zone 32. I'm also assigned to Australia and the Pacific Islands around there, 2 zones in Japan and some of those islands. Your regional grants officer may be Renee Reiling if you're in zone 28. She works with most of you, as well as other parts of the USA and the Caribbean. And the other regional grants officer here is Cecilia Walter. She works with parts of zone 28 and 32, as well as many districts in the US, 2 districts in the Philippines and 1 zone in Japan. So they're wonderful colleagues for me, and I'm sure if you work with one of them as your regional grants officer, I can tell you that you're in very good hands. Okay, so for global grant scholarships, I wanted to point out in the Learning Center, there were some updates not too long ago to have an orientation for global grant scholars. It used to be combined with vocational training teams, and now they're separate. So you can see there where it says new. And of course, the Learning Center is accessed through my Rotary if you go into Learning and Reference and find the Learning Center there. We're going to talk about scholarships and global grants. There's a page on my Rotary for that where you can find a lot of resources and reference, and we're going to go over some of those tonight. Just to highlight what is for global grant scholarships, the ones in yellow there, we have the Global Grant Scholarship Supplement. I'll show that at the end. And just so you know that there is a document, it's a PDF for how to use the Grant Center that we've made for global grant scholars themselves, because they also fill out part of the application. So that helps them to navigate, because it looks a little bit different than what the members see. And then I just have underlined there information for grant funded travelers tonight. By default, all of these applications require travel. And so that will actually take you to another page on grant funded travel, and you can learn about what our requirements are there. A little further down on that page, you'll also see a tools section. And I wanted to point out where I highlighted there, it says find your Rotary Grants officer. For scholarships, this is pretty straightforward, because whoever the regional grants officer for your district is the person who's going to review your scholarship application, and in most cases, because we do it by wherever the scholar is being interviewed and sent from. So because most of that selection process is happening at the international sponsor, that's where we have the review take place. So a little bit local to that. That's different from our humanitarian vocational training teams, where it's usually with the host sponsor regional grants officer. Something to be aware of. If you're already involved in scholarships, you're probably well aware. So scholarships in general, some of the things that we require is for global grant scholarships to be at the graduate level or above. They can be postgraduate level as well. The study period has to be a minimum of 1 year. That said, an academic year is not necessarily 12 months. So an academic year of 1 to 4 years. It does have to be aligned with at least one area of focus, the minimum budget being $30,000, and they require host and international sponsors. Now, the timeline for a global grant for scholarships, I'm starting here with the preliminary review, and you can see it's outside of the arrow here. The reason being that preliminary reviews don't take place within the grant center. It's usually emailing your regional grants officer. I would say for scholarships, this is a helpful step for you, and I would encourage you to go ahead and take advantage of it. We can do a preliminary review when you have maybe taken in some applicants and you've gotten down to your finalists, or the last few that you're considering. That's a good time to contact us and say, these are our finalists. Would you say that all of these have general alignment with the areas of focus, right? We can do a preliminary review, and I much prefer to do it that way. And I will say if a candidate appears to be eligible, and encourage you to go ahead and move forward if that's the candidate you'd like to select. And at that time, I can also share host contact information, usually the district officers, if they have a scholarship chair, if they have a district Rotary Foundation chair, I can share that information. Of course, if you're a scholarship chair, foundation chair, et cetera, you're receiving a mailing usually in July, I believe, to be able to contact your fellow officers in the same role around the world. So you should have access to that, but we're happy to provide some information quickly if that's helpful. Sometimes just to know, the host is going to be wherever the school is that the scholar is attending, so we can find out what district that is and the related officers. So once you submit your application, the regional grants officer for the international sponsor is going to be assigned to review that application. We'll evaluate it with our area focus managers if needed. It's not always necessary for scholarships, but quite often we do at least let them know and get general consensus on the scholar's background, the scholar's chosen academic program, and their future plans, and see how that's aligned. Each individual has their own unique plan. So we look at how those three things come together. What have they done in the past? What classes are they going to be taking that are related to the area of focus? And then how are they going to use that education in their future career or in their future plans to help realize, what we're all focused on as part of Rotary, right? So they don't necessarily have to join Rotary afterwards, but we want them to be involved in the causes of Rotary afterwards, right? So that's one of the reasons you could say we're supporting these scholarships in the way that we do. Oftentimes during the review, we might come back with questions for scholarships. It's often related to documentation, if not some of the alignment with the area of focus. Usually we get to that in the preliminary review. Documentation that's required, typically it needs to be, and I'll go over this in a little bit more detail in a second, their admission letter. They need to have an admission letter to their school in order to be approved by us, to explain a little bit about why we wouldn't want to approve and have, if you're using district designated funds, or even if you're sending in cash, bringing those funds in and then have the scholar say they're not accepted, right? Or something comes up where they didn't meet a condition of their admission. So we want an offer of admission with no conditions other than maybe that they require funding. Sometimes that's a financial condition, but the scholarship is going to fulfill that, so we're not worried about that one. So that can be one thing that can delay just based on the timing. If they don't have that offer letter with no conditions yet, we're gonna hold on to it. You can submit it so we can get started, but best case scenario is to submit it with that offer letter, and then we'll issue the final grant decision. So just to show you some timelines for a scholarship, let's say we're doing the calendar year here, and of course we change in July for our program year from 23 to 24 this year. Early in the year, if possible, that's when you would request your preliminary review. I've been getting some of those already, and in fact, Japan tends to do their scholar or their candidate interviews late in the calendar year, November, and start sending me their preliminary reviews then. They really get ahead of the game. You're selecting your candidate and securing a host club. You need to do that in order to submit your global grant application. And the deadline for programs, for academic programs that start in August, September, and October, as most of them in the Northern Hemisphere at least do, is June 30th. So that's taking into account the 90 days before travel, but it's also taking into account the number of scholarships applications that we get in. We set it for the June 30th deadline. This also helps with having authorizations and not having new people coming in and taking office, and all of a sudden they have to authorize an application or something like that. So getting it before that June 30th deadline has solved a lot of the delays that we were experiencing before we had that deadline. So June 30th for anything August, September, and October. If you have one earlier than that, look at the 90-day travel date. You need to submit before then. Once it's approved, we'll send out an approval notice. We'll also send out a letter of financial guarantee. That's something that almost every scholar needs to show, sometimes for their student visa, often to their school. They need to have that with them when they travel. So we do issue that. The date on that letter of financial guarantee is the date of approval. And after that, you can conduct a scholar orientation for outgoing. And oftentimes when they arrive, there would be an incoming scholar orientation. I know that tends to be the case in the United Kingdom. And after that, reporting to the foundation, my recommendation is, even though we only require a report every 12 months, as some people will realize, if you have the payment from the foundation to your club or district in the summertime, it's not always the best time to try to get the scholar themselves to do the report, as well as the other people that are involved in the grant committees. So maybe looking at the timing of when you are spending the funds, if it's tuition and other typical scholarship related expenses, I think you can time your reports around those expenses a little bit more than you would for other types of global grants. Okay, now we're going to take a look at some of the requirements and rules for global grant scholars that we have. I'm going to refer to the terms and conditions and also point out in the scholarship supplement, we have much of this information as well. So the first one to be aware of is Peace Fellows are set apart from global grant Peace Scholars. And what I mean by that is you'll find in the terms and conditions, section 2, item Y, if you look at it there, it does say that if your global grant scholar under the peace building and conflict prevention area of focus is going to a school where we have a peace center, a Rotary Peace Center, they cannot attend the same program. We don't want to mix those two because it would be a sort of competition for the same slot, if you will. So we keep that separate. If we find in the application that it's a peace scholar for global grant, and they're going to a peace center for Rotary, we'll alert you to that. Other requirements in the terms and conditions in section 3N, there's a number of different requirements listed there. One is proof of admission without academic conditions, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. Often those will be proof of a previous degree. If they're doing their master's, they may have to show proof of their undergraduate degree. Sometimes it's also a language requirement. This tends to be the case more for the scholars that I received from Japan. They need to receive a certain score on an English test, and that can cause some delays. Ultimately, we need a proof of admission without academic condition to approve. If they're required to study overseas, they can't do their study remotely from home. You'll also want to check their citizenship. Some people have dual citizenship. We can take a look at that. It doesn't necessarily mean because they have dual citizenship in the UK that they can't go study in the UK. But we'll look, are they considered by the academic institution as an overseas student? Are they doing overseas study? So we'll look at a couple factors like that because we've seen some different scenarios come up where it's not so clear cut, but essentially we want someone to have an overseas experience. And then the June 30th deadline for August, September, and October is in the terms and conditions. And in section 3N, the fourth item in the terms and conditions talks about it has to be at least one academic year, but we do allow for midpoint start dates. And what that means is if you have a 2-year program, for example, a 2-year academic program, and they've already done the first semester, it is possible for them to start from that second semester and then that second year and make that one scholarship period. So it could be, 3 of 4 semesters covering a year and a half. Even though the program would have started, it's okay as long as we can get a good midpoint start date. And we'll set that with the sponsors so that they understand when expenses can be incurred after that TRF approval date. This one we don't see too often, but from time to time, I want to point out, you should not include a scholar's personal funds or non-Rotary funding. Some people think it's helpful to show that the scholar can cover all the expenses, but in terms of for what the regional grants officer is looking for, eventually they're going to have to report on what they spent. And so we don't want the scholar's own funds or even non-Rotary funding that they wouldn't need to report to Rotary on how those funds are spent. So that shouldn't be in the funding section of the application. I often will just tell people I'm going to remove it for you. So if you can't reach that minimum $30,000 without the scholar's own personal funds, then that won't qualify for a global grant. Usually it's in addition, and so it's easy to remove. You'll find that in the terms and conditions in section 6. There's also a mention about tax law for US bound scholars. You'll find that in section 6Q. Now, the thing to be aware of here is that if a scholar is coming into the United States, their budget should be for tuition, books, and necessary equipment and some school fees. Those are non-taxable by the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. So then we can basically process those like any other scholarship. Otherwise, if they have things like accommodation for boarding, if they're buying other food and things like that, we're going to have to withhold a certain tax portion and then pay the scholar directly. If you're hosting in the US, you're probably not going to have to deal with that because the international sponsor is going to be dealing with that. Also, that it points out in the terms and conditions that this doesn't apply to places where we have an associate foundation, such as Japan. They have an associate foundation that can pay, and then it's not affecting tax issues in the US. So something to be aware of, that it might come up if you're hosting a scholar and you see that the Rotary Foundation is paying the scholar directly. This is likely the reason why. Okay, and we also have the scholar agreement. This is part of the application itself when the scholar applies, and they have to agree to certain things. And just to point out a few of them that are on there so you're aware, number 4 in our scholar agreement is the scholarship period is really when they're making, or they're incurring any expenses during the scholarship period itself. And the scholarship funds can only be used for the scholar themselves, not partners, not family. So the TRF Foundation approval date being on the letter of financial guarantee, the scholar should be well aware of the day from that letter, at least, of when they could start spending funds. And then if they are traveling with family, we can calculate what their individual expense would be, essentially, for airfares, of course, just for the scholar's airfare, for rent, if they have to have a bigger apartment or something and they are covering accommodation, we would look what would be the typical cost for an individual in that area and just do a portion of the accommodation. So we can always calculate it that way, but they do agree, the scholars themselves are agreeing in the application to only spend for themselves. Number 7 in that agreement is no remote studies. And part of that is the host sponsor relationship is what makes Rotary Scholarship special. I think most people would agree. This is something that we usually get a lot of great feedback about, the support that scholars get. The past few years have been no exception when scholars were already being hosted and all of a sudden they were told they couldn't leave their rooms. They had more support being a Rotary scholar than I think a lot of other scholarships would have. And also just to give a warning that if you are sending a scholar somewhere and you know that they're traveling with family or they require extra consideration, for example, if you're sending a scholar that uses a wheelchair, there's nowhere in our application where you would necessarily fill out that information. And part of the reason being that the scholarship funds are only for the scholar themselves. So you wouldn't really need to mention that they're traveling with their family, but the host sponsor would potentially need to know information, especially if they're planning to come pick them up at the airport and they only have a small car, right? If they're traveling with their family, maybe the host sponsor would still pick them up and they'll bring a bigger car. So we've heard feedback on that point from the United Kingdom, which does host about half of our scholars. So I wanted to point that out here to go ahead and let the host sponsor know some of this information. We do not allow deferrals. We did make an exception due to travel bans around the world, which were unexpected at the time. So now that people are generally able to travel, or they understand if they can travel, we're no longer making those exceptions. So when the scholar is set to start their studies, that's when we expect them to start. I already touched on the reporting agreement that is in the scholar agreement as well, so they should be aware, but talk to them about that and plan around, when the expenses are going to be made. And the last part here is about if the Rotary Foundation should terminate the scholarship, or even if the sponsors find cause to terminate the scholarship if they haven't followed their agreement, and that there could be a potential return of funds. My advice there is to release funds wisely. So if you receive $30,000 from the Rotary Foundation and then hand it all over to the scholar and tell them to have a good, scholarship period, your club or district, if the scholar does not report properly and turn in receipts and things like that to you, is going to have to find how to provide information to the Rotary Foundation, and in some cases return funds to the Rotary Foundation, and basically deal with the scholar if they are not in contact with you. So I would be a little bit careful maybe paying in installments to a scholar, or even paying tuition directly to the school so that you have the receipts in that way. That said, in most cases, we've seen this go very smoothly over many, many years, where scholars are able to manage the funds and submit receipts and track it very well. In most cases, these are very well-educated people. They know how to work a spreadsheet, and I get some great reports from scholars. So our Global Grant Scholarship Supplement, if you're using this document, you get a trophy there up at the top. This basically has everything that you need to know. It was updated in May 2022, most recently. It has best practices under each section, and within that document are all the links you would need to go over starting a scholarship, interviewing, the timeline. There's an example timeline there, reporting, how to work with the host sponsor and the host counselor that might be working with the scholar. So I really would recommend everything there in the Global Grant Scholarship Supplement as a very good direction. So we're right at about 6:30 here, and tonight I'm going to quote Toni Morrison, "You are the best thing." And I like this quote for scholarships, because really, when you're a student even at the graduate level, receiving this type of support from Rotary or anywhere else, but especially from Rotary, it could be the best thing of their lives. It could change their lives, and really you're making it happen. So it's a wonderful thing to be proud of, I think. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see everybody a little bit better here. And we'll take just a few minutes for any questions and clarifications on Global Grant Scholarships before we head into the next section on vocational training teams. So you're free to unmute, and I'll take a quick look through the chat. I don't see any questions per se in the chat, so I didn't see who raised their hand first. Would it be Jillian or Leslie?
Jillian.
Okay, thank you. Jillian, go ahead.
Hi there, Stephen. I'm not sure if this is a question or an invitation. I'm interested in learning a little bit more about, I guess less about the technical that you shared with us this evening, but more about recruiting potential scholars and in ideas, in particular with inbound scholars. I'm in Halifax, Nova Scotia, an area with wonderful post-secondary institutions that would attract people globally, and I'd like to be thought of as the destination of choice for scholars to come here. But I don't know where to go to start that, putting our name out there, as we are being open and available to other districts that would like to send us global grant scholars. I'd love to have a very attractive inbound welcoming orientation for all of our global grant scholars and so on. To my knowledge, we've only had one so far in the last 5 years come to our district. So I'd love to hear from maybe if there's a way, if I put my email address in the chat, and if there's other districts that have found a way to attract inbound, I'd love to hear about that.
I can make comment on that really quickly, but first I just have a question of clarification. In that scenario, I think it could go two ways primarily, based on whether or not the receiving district would be putting in any district designated funds. Whoever is going to be funding the scholarship, usually does control that application process quite a bit, and directing the scholar or bringing in the scholar, interviewing them, and so forth. In the scenario that you gave, Julian, do you think that are you whether or not you know, do you envision that your district would be giving funds?
For the volume that I'm thinking of initially, it would be a no. We would be on the we would be the host club.
Right. Okay.
For the scholar to come to, or the host district, I should say.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, I do think that, actually sponsoring a scholar and using funding and whatnot, even for outgoing, but it is also possible to use your funding for scholars that are incoming. That's happened a few times where there's a very good university and you're able to contact scholars at the undergraduate level, maybe before they start their graduate level studies, or even those who are already doing 1 year of their master's. You can support them for their second year or before they get into the PhD program, right? If you kind of catch them there, partnering up with the university. Sometimes alumni networks are very good. I know that tends to be how Japan leverages finding candidates, is through alumni networks. And so that would be very good. I also know that Global Grant scholars talk to each other quite a bit. So I think once word sort of gets out there, that is a way to promote certain schools in a sense. So that could be a benefit of, even if you're only sponsoring one incoming Global Grant scholar, that person might be telling other people, hey, Rotary is really great. So if you're not going to be funding the candidate, on the other hand, I think it's a little bit harder to attract students in that way as a destination, other than what the reputation of the university already is, or if you know of certain programs at that university that fit with our areas of focus very well, certainly letting others know about that. I can say that a lot of our scholars come from Japan and the US. And so if you are in Canada, letting those districts know about a certain school in your district, that would be who you want to target. We get a lot of, I think Korea might be one as well. Also districts in Germany, Italy. Those tend to be sponsors of scholarships as well as the UK. Okay, Leslie.
Hi. So we're in District 7090, which is a cross-border district. We are looking at hosting a student at our local university. We will be the host, and our cross-border country in the US will be the international partner. The student going to the school is from outside of Canada. We hooked up with the university locally to tell them that we wanted somebody in to be studying in the environmental sustainability area, and they have recently started a PhD program. So we're looking at doing a scholarship for that, and we as host will be funding that student. My question is, we are now proposing this to our club and our various clubs in our district, and we keep getting the comment, well, that's a lot of money to focus on for one student. And we keep responding with, well, it's changing lives, it's working in the area of focus, that Rotary Foundation supports this idea of scholarships. Do you have a response that would be a good response to these comments, where a lot of money, we're talking $40, $50, $60, $70,000 for one person? So how would you say we could respond to that comment?
Yeah, I think you're already giving a good response. Some people just, one way that I think about that is some people just have their focus elsewhere, right? It's not necessarily in the scholarship realm. However, thinking about it as just one person, that is not necessarily the right way in my mind to capture what a scholarship does, right? You're supporting whatever knowledge is contained in that program, right? And if you look at, one thing I would suggest is going to the Giving and Grants newsletter. That there's a link that in one that just went out to our Global Grants evaluation that covered quite a bit about what scholarship alumni are doing. That shows some of the effects that these scholarships have that do benefit our causes and also Rotarians in terms of the knowledge that's there and the relationships that are formed. A lot of alumni come back and speak at district conferences. They might even get involved in helping with a humanitarian global grant. And here you have a person who is very grateful, very driven, and trained to at a very high level in a certain area of focus. So I think it's a good way to further our causes in that way as well. It's another way to think about it. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, we're at 6:40, so I'm going to move on to vocational training teams. And if there are other questions about scholarships, you're welcome to still put it in the chat or reach out to me later. All right, so for vocational training teams, in the next 20 to 30 minutes, we're going to cover a little bit about how these teams are made up, a review of the required attachments that are required in the application to attach, and then discuss some of the best practices. Again, luckily this is being recorded, so I might have to move a little bit quickly, but it'll all be there. So again, I don't know if anybody jumped on. I know that there's at least, I think, 10 or 20 people compared to when we started. So I am Steve Sundstrom, Regional Grants Officer for Zone 32, or at least most of Zone 32. If you're in Zone 28, likely your Regional Grants Officer is Renee Reiling, and Cecilia Walter covers parts of 28 and 32. So these are the Regional Grants Officers for your zones. The Learning Center, we do have orientation just for vocational training teams now broken out, so you can find that in the Learning Center through my Rotary. And in the green here, what I have pointed out is through my Rotary, when you go through Apply for Grants and Global Grants, you'll find the resources and reference. And these three that I have in green, the training plan for global grants is often used for humanitarian, but this is also very useful, obviously, for vocational training teams. You can outline for us very clearly how that training is going to take place. And we prefer this template because we're familiar with it. It's not required, but it can be helpful. Vocational training team itinerary is required. We need to know the at least planned departure and return dates. We understand that these things can change, but having the itinerary really helps us understand what the project's going to look like. And then the last one there is the vocational training team member application. This is explaining to that potential member sort of how vocational training team projects work, what's expected of them. There's an area there for them to explain how their skills are going to be used. And then in addition to that, they're going to be sending us a resume, but it's to confirm that they're qualified. Essentially, they'll sign that and attach it to the application. So that's required as well. And then again, just to point out in the tools section below resources and reference on that page, you can find your regional grants officer. That's handy for anytime you're making you're putting together an application. For vocational training teams, it is wherever the training is taking place. Sometimes there's a team going and coming, so you can kind of take your pick on who you make the host. But it's generally we assign the regional grants officer for wherever the host sponsor is indicated in the application. So for vocational training teams, they still do align with an area of focus, of course. The minimum budget is still $30,000 with a host and international sponsor. They need 3 or more volunteer travelers that are part of the vocational training team. Humanitarian grants allow for up to 2. So vocational training teams are 3+. That's one way to think of it. We require that each member of the vocational training team has 2 or more years of related professional experience aligned with that area of focus. That's what we're looking for. And that the team leader, whoever is chosen, they're going to be involved in the reporting. So whoever the team leader is, we often recommend that we do recommend that it's a member of Rotary. The reason being that they're a little bit more motivated to log in and do the report and understand what we require for expense reporting and whatnot. So if the team leader can be a Rotarian, that's a plus in sense of reporting. If there's reason that it's not a Rotarian, that it happens quite often too, and it's okay. So some of the rules and requirements for vocational training teams, referring to the terms and conditions here. I put the first one as a question. Can Rotary members receive training in a vocational training team? Give you a second to think about it. And the answer would be no, and I would refer you to the conflict of interest policy for grants. So Rotary members can provide training, certainly, be part of a vocational training team if they're providing training. If they are receiving training, then they should be non-members. So you can look at the Section 1M or Section 10 is our conflict of interest policy and the terms and conditions. The requirements in Section 3.0, they're outlined there, similar to the scholarships actually. Each member has to have professional experience aligned with the area of focus. The team leader should be a Rotary member, but like I said, it's not a requirement. And same to primary sponsors, even if there is more than one team. So your team has to go sort of in between the two sponsors. You may have 2 teams or 3 teams. They need to travel at least within 1 year of each other so that we are aware that it's the same project with the same objectives. We don't want this to be something that where you're sending a team once a year or something like that. The last one I think is helpful to know. I've gotten this question a few times, that it is okay to change the team composition, and it just requires pre-approval by the foundation, by your regional grants officer. And the last one there is to submit 90 days before the travel is scheduled. Okay, and some of the documentation that you will find required in the application itself. Of course, vocational training teams also need a community assessment, the member application, a resume or curriculum vitae with 2+ years of related experience, the travel itinerary, training plan for global grants is a nice to have, I would say. And then, vocational training teams, it's not always just training. Sometimes there is some equipment that's included. I've seen a lot with those that deal with in the medical community for probably disease prevention and treatment, right? There might be some equipment that they're including there. So provide some related documents to that, pro forma invoices and whatnot, if you also have equipment. And just like any other global grant, you're submitting the bank account information prior to approval. This also helps us to see who's going to be managing the funds, or if it's going to be split. Let's say you do have 2 teams, you might want to split that payment, and we'll pay some to the host sponsor and some to the international sponsor. This is a view of the application itself. When you're creating teams in the application, you'll see up here, I just used an older application that we have, and there's one incoming team. They're going to Australia. There was an outgoing team going to Timor-Leste. And this first green arrow is pointing to a paper clip, and that is where you attach the itinerary for the training team. And down here, we have the names of each member, and the team leader is indicated with a check mark, and another paper clip. And that's where you attach at least 2 documents, the member application form, and then the resume or CV. And this is done, you make one of these for each team that's going. So I put there next to here, the first bullet, each departure and return trip is considered a new team entry. That's one way to think of it. The team leader can be the same or different for each team, depending. So if the incoming team, like that's the first one up here, maybe they're doing 2 trips, one in April, May, and then another in June, July. They could have the same team leader, of course. In this case, I marked out their names because it's personal information, but they had a different team member for the incoming and a different person for the outgoing. Later, when you're reporting, like I said, that team leader is going to be involved in, actually, they'll have access to the report and have input on the report. One thing to note here is you'll see in the application, it asks, has this vocational training team completed its training? So if you do have multiple trips, you're reporting on only what's taken place during that reporting period, and you click yes. If the training hasn't taken place in that reporting period, you can click no, and then it's not going to require you to fill out the information. Basically, by clicking yes, you're saying we want to tell you about it. So if it's a past one and you've already reported on it, you could actually click no, so it's not going to require you to report on it again. I don't know that our report is very clear on that, because I do get questions about that sometimes, so I wanted to point that out here. Click yes if you want to fill out the details per report to the foundation. And also, this is a little further down in the screen, but I put it over here, is the training team leader only is involved in the reporting, not the other members of the team. And they will have to click to certify that the above answers are complete and then submit and authorize, just like others that are part of the sponsor committees. So having a team leader that has a good understanding of getting onto my Rotary and accessing the grant center, that's another consideration when you're selecting who will be the team leader. Okay, and so looking at a straight timeline for vocational training teams, we also still encourage a preliminary review for these, of course. Go to the regional grants officer where the training is being hosted. You'll submit, we'll review, evaluate with the area focus manager as appropriate, ask questions. Maybe there's sometimes the signatures on the VTT member application those signatures can be missing. I often go back and say, oh, it looks like we missed a signature. A lot of times it's things like this or clarification about the travel itinerary. So it can be very helpful if you take a last look at that before you upload, because there can be a lot of attachments for these types of applications. Once we have everything together, we'll issue a final grant decision, and hopefully you'll have your grant. Now, last week I presented this project as an example, and it does happen to be a vocational training team. So I'm just going to talk about it again here really quickly. So for this one, it has a number for Global Grant 18, meaning that they started it in the 2018 program year. I'm going to talk about timeline a little bit, and I want to use this one as an example. So this sponsor in Australia, Jennifer Scott, was actually the lead, and she's from the Rotary Club of Central Blue Mountains in Australia near Sydney. She sent me a community assessment that they had done within the previous year. She sent me proposal itineraries for 2 teams, one going to Mongolia and one from Mongolia coming to Australia to receive training. And so I had a good idea of what this vocational training team would involve, right? And she also sent me a project summary about goals and whatnot that was helpful to understand what their budget might be and the purpose of the project. So receiving that, I let them know that everything looked good. They could go ahead and submit their application, which they did in March of 2019. I approved it for $32,000 less than a month later, and they were paid in May of 2019. So they're going to have to report by May of 2020. What they ended up doing was their first trip took place that summer, and they just sent me an email, and with some pictures and whatnot that everything was going well. They could have submitted a progress report then and then had their final report a year later. But they ended up submitting their progress report in May 2020. They let me know that they had some leftover funds and they wanted to do some additional translations for court mediation documents, because this one, as you can see here in the title, was dealing with family and community conflict resolution. It's a peace building and conflict prevention type of area focus grant. So they were able to do that, and it seemed like it was a very helpful project. You can read about it both on the Rotary Voices blog and the September issue of the Rotary magazine. And then they submitted a final report in November 2021. So it all went pretty smoothly, I think, because they worked very closely before considering a global grant and getting that community assessment done. And then they sent me all that information. So even if they weren't quite sure how to set up the application, I could have guided them well on setting up those teams, because that can really be a stumbling block sometimes. So again, using that as an example, you can see here, they sent me information early in the year on their community assessment project summary, their itinerary, submitting it 90 days before they're planning to leave, which they were going to do in the summer, and they submitted early in the spring. We were able to send out the approval notice and pay. And that gives time for people to take time off work if they need to do that, if the trainers are actually going to be taking leave to go do this, to purchase their tickets at a reasonable rate and whatnot. And then also we do require travel orientation for vocational training team members, so doing the orientation. So it's important for that 90 days to give enough time for the review. And then finally, this thinking about how you'll report to the foundation, making sure that the VTT leader is aware that they have to sign off. And that's what I have to say about vocational training teams, at least for this evening. I'll quote Toni Morrison once again. I like this one related to training teams. If you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. And passing on professional knowledge is a great way to do that. And that's what we see achieved in these vocational training teams. So I do want to thank everyone for your attention this evening. And we're almost at 7 o'clock my time here in Chicago. I see there might be some new comments in the chat, but I can also take questions about what I just presented about vocational training teams if anybody has questions. I do see one, what does training plan for global grants mean? This is a template that shows explanation of the content of any training that's going to take place in a project. So you can enter in there certain topics that are going to be covered. It also asks very detailed questions. Who will be providing the training? Why are they qualified? Who will be receiving the training? How are they selected? And that's really to make sure that we're targeted in on the right people that need to know the right information and how it will be delivered. For a regular humanitarian project, we're often going to want follow-up and whatnot. We do like to see follow-up in vocational training teams as well, but since you're working on that professional level, usually professionals teaching other professionals, you know, the intake of that information is going to be better there too. So keep that in mind. And Bala, I see you have your hand up. You got a question?
Well, I thought you would be disappointed if I left a session without asking you a question, Steve.
That's right.
The information as usually present in a very simple and easy manner to understand. My question relates not so much on the VTT itself, but the legacy that it left almost, I think, over 10 years back. They both have 3 letters, except that other than that, the commonest stops there, the GSC versus VTT. I was wondering do you still get questions on, I know there are really good reasons why we discontinued GSC in addition to not being funded by the TRF, but now more folk leading on the global. Other than that, you still get questions? In case we get questions, that's why I'm asking that.
Yeah, of course, group study exchange is a very popular program for good reason as well. And as you mentioned, the shift to vocational training teams was to bring it into ensuring that professional information was being shared, and sort of like Toni Morrison was saying in my quote, that we're empowering people through how we're using the contributions. We've basically said that group study exchange can happen in a certain way through district grants. They still have to follow the conflict of interest policy for program participants. So take a look at that. But we have seen some projects where it's possible to do something that's like a group study exchange in the district grant. That would probably be maybe the only answer we have for that, since essentially the GSE are not allowed in global grants anymore. But yeah, we still do get questions about it sometimes.
I have one quick follow-up. Thank you. One of the other districts from the other part of the world, they wanted to do a VTT, and the first thing I shared with them is we need to do a community assessment. There was a little bit of pushback on that. They said, it's only for global grants and not for VTT. Was I right in saying community assessment is a good primer and requirement?
Yes, so VTTs are a global grant. That would be one way to just think of it. And it's a type of global grant, at least. And it's very important to do a community assessment for these, of course, to make sure that you're training the right people. And you have the right people conducting the training. That's something that's a little bit more clear because we're reviewing the applications and the resumes and whatnot. But who are they going to be training? How is that information going to be used? That's all going to come in through the community assessment. Without it, we don't know how effective that will be. Scholarships are the exception. We don't require a community assessment because we're really interviewing the scholar. They're the single beneficiary direct from the grant. So that would be the one that we don't require community assessment.
On a personal note, I want to thank everybody here and not here, because I have been a Rotary Foundation Ambassador Scholar many, many years ago.
Excellent. Thanks, Paula. Okay, and I see one more question in the chat. Can a VTT be done as a district grant with no community assessment? We don't require community assessments in district grants, and VTTs are eligible within district grants, so that we would not be asking about community assessment in that case. So we're just a few minutes past the hour, so I do want to respect everyone's time. I'm happy to answer questions as before. For a little bit if people want to stay on for a little while longer, but otherwise we'll close out. I'll hand things back to Eileen and Ingrid. And I just want to say again, thank you to everybody for everything that you've been doing, not only these past 5 days, but some of you I've been working with for many years now. And it's really a pleasure to have partners, I would say, on the ground level, like all of you. It makes my job pleasurable. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. These sessions are wonderful, and I know we're getting some good questions, good feedback. People are very excited about learning about grants. Ingrid, did you want to say anything about what you're doing with Zone 28?
Sure. I just, as yesterday I mentioned, Rotary's Peace Month is February, and we have a Focus on Peace session coming up February 21st. It is going to give us some new updates and some Rotary stories about our Peace Center. So we have Fergal McCarthy, who's the program manager for all the peace programs at Rotary International. We have Summer Lewis, who is the partnership coordinator with the Institute for Economics of Peace. Of course, we have our own trustee, Marty Hellman, who's going to be telling us all about the new Peace Center. And Dr. Simona Pinton, who is a Rotary Peace Fellow. She's also an international law expert. And she's going to be talking about some projects, some global grant projects for the area of focus for peace building. So I welcome you to join us. You can register looking at Zone 28. It's on the Zone 2832 website. or you can just send me a note. And I've also sent some information out to the district governors and the district Rotary Foundation chairs. Hope to see you there. And I just want to finish off, Steve, you are amazing. I said to him today, I think he's like hero status now for all of us that have been with you for the last 5 days. And I really appreciate, Eileen, all the work that you did to get this going. And the benefit for all of us is that we have these recordings that we can use and look at and share with our districts. So thank you. And as Steve said, there's been great commitment by our Rotarians these 5 days. So thank you to each one of you for being here.
Eileen, did you want to say anything as we close out before I stop recording?
Yeah, just I'll reiterate what I said at the beginning, because I know some people logged in after the fact. I'm thinking of working on a workshop about stewardship qualification to answer some of the questions that have come up during our workshops. Particularly, can a district require a club to give to the annual fund in order to be qualified to apply for grants or to receive grant funds? So as I put my email in the chat, just shoot me an email, because we can obviously get this going, and Steve had contacted the stewardship department, and they would be very pleased to do that. So, but yeah, we want more than 3 people there. So I wanted to see what the interest was. But thank you. This is great. I hope everybody has a great weekend. And it was great spending so much time with everyone. There's nothing like being with a bunch of Rotarians.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.